It was reported in an early profile of Walter Gorman Spanner that the ancestor for whom he was named had worn a pair of dentures made of ivory and human teeth. The reporter had not been able to establish that the teeth had belonged to slaves, and Walt Spanner Jr. quite regularly made headlines for tweeting the truth to power. How's that trickle-down economy going, Bezos? So for a long while, his reputation hadn't suffered from the tooth thing a bit. Whenever the sun hit Walt through his study window, he glowed like a whole field of wheat. The window looked over and past the garden that his wife had designed, a garden full of apple trees which had grown to their full height miles away, and with a small tiled pool which was not for swimming, but for throwing spots of light onto the study ceiling and the old abandoned CrossFit. His wife was leaving him, or had left already. Walt could see a man with a camera looking through the rubbish bins on the other side of the garden wall. Walt smiled, a brilliant smile, a smile like a Kennedy in a field of wheat. What was the man with the camera going to find in his rubbish except empty wine bottles and some magazines? Let him have his fun. He even waved to the man, which would have been worth a lot more money, but this went unnoticed. It had been 4 years since Walt had become a star, a real star, the kind of star you could lean into being, the kind of star whose burning edges you could see and move and adjust when you closed your eyes by the swimming pool. Before 4 years ago, he'd had some following. He'd played a hard-boiled cop in one movie, and a lawyer in another, and 1 or 2 different men with machine guns. He was enough of a thing that a gif of him tearing into a burger had once gone close to viral. Still, there were only big roles in small films. But now a man with a camera was rifling through his bins, and there were listicles investigating whether or not his relationship with one Italian director could actually be called romantic. The New York Times had run a profile on his bachelor party in the Australian bush, and said that Manhattan men better watch out because he, Walt Spanner, was putting knot-tying, hunting, and plain old fire-making back on the menu. He was a living cowboy. And it didn't matter where she was now. There were apples on the trees. He was thinking about his starriness when the first thing happened. Well, he was drinking a chamomile tea with honey and reading the first few pages of a sequel, and it occurred to him that maybe the star would go vegan. When his phone trilled, he picked it up on the second ring. He always did. It was part of the thing. He wasn't too famous to pick up a phone when it rang. You won't believe this. Walt stayed at the table for a long time after his agent had hung up. He tried to picture the warm, lawny tea cycling through his whole body, slowing the blood in his tensed and thrumming thighs. The honey ribboned over his wide sailor's shoulders and into the tips of his fingers. He had as long as the screenshots remained unverified to prepare. An old professor from his 2 terms at UCal had been arrested a few months before for sexual assault and had described long bilious years of anxiety, of waiting for the knock at the door. It was a relief when it came, he'd said, but Walt did not feel relief. It's always strange seeing the words you've written to someone you love outside of their context. Sometimes he scrolled up as far as he could to the conversations he'd had with his wife before California, before their wedding even. He wondered if she'd be looking at these new messages now, his messages to 2, 3 other women blown out of proportion. In one text, he'd asked Marie to be his property until she died, and asked if he could cut off one of her toes to keep her in his possession always. Anna had leaked some of his messages as well, the first time he'd ever used the word cannibal, and a text about him jacking off to the thought of holding her beating heart in his hand. Would his wife make the connection to the time with the deer in Colorado? The text went on, and none of the articles or accounts to which they linked made it clear that he'd never done anything but thought and written. Instead, all the images he'd cherished in the dark and never manifested except for on iMessage, the broken bones and Marie crawling down the hallway to get away from him, and the tying her up and sucking Anna's blood out of her shattered wrist, these were public domain. It was a violence. Walt Spanner Cannibal Kink, each word increasingly optimized for a headline. The media loved it. Why won't you stand against abusers? They cawed at anyone who suggested mistruth or exaggeration. He'd been shouting it the entire time, they decided. Just under his celebrated Jeff Bezos tweet was a snippet of a poem about hiding under skins. The burger gif had become familiar beyond belief. The director who'd been about to fly Walt out to Europe emailed him politely to say that she thought it would probably be for the best if he dropped out of the film. Well, he'd say to the papers, he couldn't leave his kid at home anyway, not when these lies were being circulated. And then Nadia broke, and his wife said that he'd better stay in California, that his son wouldn't see him. Sweet Nadia, fast in the night like a deer. It was Nadia who'd awakened it in him, like the first babysitter to wear a blouse, and from there he couldn't put it down. With her he'd been a child in the first flush of desire, a rough child, a boy. He'd long given up pulling his wife's hair, though that had been half their courtship. His wife had been tired with the baby and with the press and had fine lines under her eyes. Walt saw her leave the bathroom door open and understood this to mean, I am no longer subject to your exhausting adoration. Then Nadia arrived, bearing coffee for the crew, and there'd been something inexhaustible about her neck.